In the hushed corridors of power, where medals gleam like silent witnesses to sacrifice and orders echo like thunder through marble halls, one sentence shattered decades of military decorum: if you win, I'll give you children. It wasn't shouted in the heat of battle, nor whispered in the intimacy of a private confession. No, it was spoken with chilling precision in the heart of the Pentagon's most secure war room, under the cold fluorescence of strategic command lighting, during a classified briefing that would determine the fate of a covert operation spanning 3 continents. The words hung in the air like shrapnel, sharp, unexpected, and devastatingly personal. Every officer present, from seasoned colonels to junior intelligence analysts, felt the temperature in the room drop. Not because of the air conditioning, but because something sacred had just been violated, the unspoken covenant of mutual respect that binds those who wear the uniform. In that instant, the rigid hierarchy of rank seemed to dissolve, replaced by a raw, human tension that no protocol could contain. The phrase, so flippant on the surface, yet so loaded beneath, wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of war not against an enemy nation, but against the very soul of military brotherhood and sisterhood. And the woman who uttered it? Captain Elena Reyes, 34 years old, Bronze Star recipient, fluent in 3 languages, and the first Latina to lead a joint special operations task force. She stood at the edge of the polished oak table, arms crossed, eyes blazing with a mixture of defiance, exhaustion, and something deeper, something that looked suspiciously like pain. She hadn't planned to say it. It had slipped out like a bullet from a chamber she thought was empty. But once fired, there was no recalling it. And across the table, seated with the stillness of a mountain, was the man she'd just targeted, General Marcus Thorne. The words weren't whispered in jest or spoken in love. They were hurled like a grenade in the middle of a high-stakes strategy meeting by Captain Elena Reyes, a decorated American officer known for her sharp tongue and sharper mind. Her reputation preceded her. At West Point, she'd graduated top of her class despite being told she didn't look like a leader. In Afghanistan, she'd coordinated a drone strike that neutralized a high-value target while minimizing civilian casualties, a maneuver so precise it was later taught at the Army War College. Yet for all her accolades, she carried the invisible weight of being the exception, the woman who had to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. That morning, she'd walked into the briefing already frayed. She'd spent the previous 36 hours analyzing satellite feeds, cross-referencing intercepted communications, and arguing with logistics officers who kept delaying her team's deployment. And now in this room, she watched as General Thorne, calm, composed, immaculate in his pressed uniform, dismissed her tactical proposal with a single wave of his hand, calling it overly aggressive and emotionally driven. The implications stung more than the words, that her judgment was clouded by her gender, her passion mistaken for instability. So when he leaned forward and said, almost gently, "Captain, sometimes the wisest move is restraint," something inside her snapped. The grenade rolled from her lips before she could stop it. "If you win, I'll give you children." It was absurd. It was offensive. It was the kind of remark that could end a career. But in that moment, it felt like the only language left that he might understand, because power, to men like him, was often measured in legacy, in lineage, in what you leave behind. She didn't mean it literally. She meant, you think you're entitled to everything, even my future, just because you wear more stars than I do. Her target. General Marcus Thorne, 5-star legend, architect of modern U.S. defense doctrine, and a man whose name alone commanded silence in any room. At 62, Thorne had served under 4 presidents, reshaped counter-terrorism strategy after September 11th, and was rumored to have personally negotiated the release of hostages in Yemen without a single shot fired. His office walls were lined not with trophies, but with letters, from Gold Star families, from cadets he'd mentored, from foreign allies who called him the conscience of the Pentagon. He rarely raised his voice. His authority came not from volume, but from presence. When he entered a room, conversations didn't stop, they deepened. People leaned in, not out of fear, but out of respect for a mind that had carried the weight of national security for over 3 decades. He was known for his patience, his strategic foresight, and his uncanny ability to see the human cost behind every decision. Yet even legends have blind spots. Thorne had spent so long navigating the corridors of power that he sometimes forgot what it felt like to stand at the edge of them, watching, waiting, proving yourself over and over while others were handed trust like a birthright. He hadn't meant to belittle Reyes. In his mind, he was offering guidance, tempering what he saw as youthful impulsivity with hard-won wisdom. But leadership isn't just about intent, it's about impact. And in that moment, his well-meaning caution felt like another door closing in her face. Gasps rippled through the war room. Officers froze. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause in disbelief. A junior lieutenant dropped his stylus. A senior colonel slowly closed his briefing folder, as if shielding himself from the fallout. The digital clock on the wall ticked, 9:47 a.m., but time itself seemed suspended. Security protocols dictated that such meetings were recorded, but no one moved to stop the feed. Everyone knew this moment would be dissected for weeks, maybe years. Would it be cited in ethics seminars? Used as a cautionary tale in leadership training? Or worse, leaked to the press, turning a private rupture into a public scandal about gender, power, and the soul of the American military? Eyes darted between Reyes and Thorne, searching for cues. Would the general explode? Would he demand her removal? Would he call for a court-martial on the spot? But Thorne did none of those things. He simply sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable, not angry, not amused, not even surprised. It was as if he'd been expecting this reckoning all along. And perhaps he had. For months, whispers had circulated about growing tensions between the old guard and the new generation of officers, diverse, tech-savvy, and unwilling to accept the way things have always been as justification for exclusion. Reyes wasn't just speaking for herself. She was voicing the frustration of hundreds who'd been told to be patient while watching their ideas ignored and their promotions delayed. The room held its breath, waiting for the storm to break. But General Thorne didn't flinch. He simply looked at Captain Reyes, not with anger, but with a sorrow so deep it carved lines into his weathered face that hadn't been there a moment before. His eyes, usually sharp as flint, softened with something ancient and heavy, grief, perhaps, or regret. He saw not an insubordinate officer, but a brilliant mind on the verge of burning out. He saw the same fire he'd once carried, before decades of compromise had tempered it into something quieter, more measured. And in that gaze, something shifted. The power dynamic didn't reverse, it transformed. No longer was this a clash of rank, but a collision of two souls shaped by service, yet scarred by its costs. Thorne knew the weight of words. He'd spent his career choosing them with surgical precision, knowing that a single sentence could launch a war or prevent one. So when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of a man who had buried too many of his own. "You mistake strength for arrogance, Captain," he said, each word deliberate, "and legacy for conquest." The room remained silent, but the air was no longer tense, it was charged with possibility. Because in those 10 words, Thorne hadn't defended his ego. He'd extended an invitation, to see beyond the stars on his shoulders, to understand that true leadership isn't about winning arguments, but about winning trust. And in that moment, the grenade Captain Reyes had thrown didn't detonate, it became a seed. "You mistake strength for arrogance, Captain," he said quietly, "and legacy for conquest." The words didn't land like a reprimand, they settled like dust after an explosion, revealing the ruins beneath the surface. Thorne's voice carried no condescension, only a quiet gravity that seemed to pull the very air toward him. It was the voice of a man who had spent decades making decisions where lives hung in the balance, where a single misstep could echo across continents and generations. He wasn't defending his title or his rank, he was offering her a mirror. And in that reflection, Captain Reyes saw not the defiant warrior she believed herself to be, but a woman so consumed by the fight for recognition that she'd begun to mimic the very arrogance she despised. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. That, in itself, was a kind of courage. Around them, the war room remained frozen. No one dared move, breathe, or even blink. They sensed they were witnessing something rare, not a disciplinary moment, but a turning point. The kind of exchange that doesn't appear in after-action reports but lingers in the quiet corners of military memory, passed down in hushed tones during late-night watches or over coffee in base cafeterias. Thorne's words weren't just a correction, they were a challenge. "Do you truly understand what you're fighting for?" And for the first time in months, maybe years, Reyes felt the armor around her heart crack, just enough to let doubt slip through. Was she fighting for justice, or for vengeance? For equality, or for dominance? The line between them had never felt so thin. The room trembled not from fear, but from the weight of what had just been exposed, a culture where respect had been replaced by rivalry, and honor by humiliation. It wasn't just about Reyes and Thorne, it was about every officer who had ever been told to tone it down, because their passion was too much. Every woman who'd been passed over for command because she lacked the right demeanor. Every junior enlisted who'd swallowed their ideas because the brass knows best. The military prided itself on unity, on cohesion under fire, yet beneath the polished surface of protocol and discipline, fissures had been growing. The old guard clung to tradition like a life raft, while the new generation demanded evolution, not just inclusion. And in that tension, respect had become transactional, granted only when you conformed, not when you contributed. Reyes's outburst, however inappropriate, had ripped the bandage off a wound that had been festering for years. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was sacred. It was the silence of reckoning. One colonel later admitted he'd felt ashamed, not of Reyes, but of himself. He remembered the time he dismissed a female lieutenant's intel because she was being emotional, only to learn days later she'd been right. Another officer recalled how he'd laughed off a similar comment years ago, thinking it was just locker room talk, never realizing how it eroded trust from within. In that moment, the war room became more than a place of strategy, it became a confessional. And Thorne, by refusing to retaliate, had given them all permission to see the truth, that a military that cannot hold itself accountable is a military that cannot win the peace. Captain Reyes had once idolized Thorne. She'd pinned his photo above her academy desk, studied his campaigns like scripture, and dreamed of earning his nod of approval. Back at West Point, while her peers plastered their walls with movie stars or sports legends, Reyes had taped a grainy newspaper clipping of Thorne accepting the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Beneath it, she'd written in bold letters, "Lead with mind, serve with heart." She'd read his memoirs cover to cover, annotated his speeches, and even modeled her leadership style after his, calm under pressure, decisive in chaos, always putting mission before ego. She remembered the first time she saw him in person, at a graduation ceremony, standing tall in his dress blues, his voice steady as he spoke about sacrifice not as a burden, but as a privilege. That day, she'd sworn she'd one day stand beside him, not as a subordinate, but as a peer. She'd carried that dream through sandstorms in Iraq, through sleepless nights in intelligence bunkers, through the sting of being the only woman in the room time and again. Every promotion, every commendation, every late-night debrief, she'd imagined Thorne watching, nodding, finally saying, "You belong here." But somewhere along the way, the idol had become an obstacle. Not because he changed, but because the system he represented had failed her. And when admiration curdles into resentment, even the purest intentions can taste like betrayal. But years of being overlooked, underestimated, and told to wait her turn, while less qualified men rose through the ranks had hardened her heart into armor. It wasn't just one slight, it was 1,000 paper cuts. The time her op plan was credited to a male colleague. The promotion board that praised her potential, but chose someone with more command presence, a phrase she knew was code for looks like the men were used to. The whispered comments in hallways, she got that slot because of diversity quotas. Even when she saved 3 lives during a convoy ambush, the after-action report barely mentioned her name. Each incident alone was survivable. Together, they forged a shield of cynicism so thick she could barely feel her own idealism anymore. She began to believe that respect wasn't earned, it was taken. And if the system wouldn't give her a seat at the table, she'd flip the table over. That morning, when Thorne dismissed her proposal as emotionally driven, it wasn't just another critique, it was the final thread snapping. Because she knew her plan was sound. She'd run the simulations, cross-checked the intel, accounted for every variable. But to him, it was just another risky move from the passionate young officer. The irony was crushing, the very qualities that made her effective, her intuition, her empathy, her refusal to accept collateral damage as acceptable loss, were the same ones used to disqualify her from true authority. So when she lashed out, it wasn't really at Thorne. It was at every gatekeeper who'd ever made her prove she belonged, while others were simply assumed to. That day, she thought she was striking back at a system, not at the man who'd quietly advocated for her promotions behind closed doors. What she didn't know, what no one had told her, was that General Thorne had been her silent champion for years. After her Bronze Star recommendation was initially downgraded by a skeptical review board, it was Thorne who personally intervened, calling the lead evaluator to demand a re-review. When her name came up for the Joint Special Operations slot, it was Thorne who argued passionately that leadership isn't about fitting the mold, it's about breaking it when necessary. He'd even blocked a transfer that would have sidelined her to a desk job, insisting she belonged in the field. But he'd never told her. Not out of pride, But because he believed true mentorship didn't seek gratitude, it sought growth. He wanted her to succeed on her own merit, not because she knew someone was pulling strings for her. And so, while she saw him as the face of an unyielding hierarchy, he saw her as the future of a more inclusive, more effective military. Her outburst wounded him, not because it insulted his rank, but because it revealed how deeply the system had failed to communicate its support. In his silence after her comment, there was no anger, only sorrow that she hadn't known she already had an ally in the highest echelons of power. And in that sorrow lay the seed of redemption, not just for her, but for the institution they both loved enough to fight for, even when it broke their hearts. What she didn't know was that Thorn had lost his only son in the line of duty, a young lieutenant whose name now graced a military hospital wing. The wound was over a decade old, yet it never scabbed over. It remained raw, pulsing beneath the surface of his stoicism like a second heartbeat. Lieutenant Daniel Thorn had been 24, bright-eyed, idealistic, and stubbornly compassionate, much like Reyes in her early days. He'd volunteered for a humanitarian mission in Syria, leading a medical convoy through contested territory. When an IED struck, he'd shielded a civilian child with his own body, taking the full blast. He died en route to the field hospital, whispering his father's name with his last breath. General Thorn had been briefed in the pre-dawn hours, standing alone in his office as the sun rose over the Potomac. He didn't cry, not then. He signed 3 deployment orders, reviewed 2 intelligence summaries, and chaired a strategy meeting before allowing himself to collapse into the leather chair behind his desk, where he wept silently for the first time in 30 years. Since then, he'd carried his grief like a second uniform, impeccably maintained, never mentioned, but always present. He'd refused all offers of early retirement, saying, "If I stop serving, I stop honoring him." The hospital wing named after Daniel wasn't just a memorial, it was Thorn's penance, his promise that no family would suffer in silence if he could help it. And children, that word, wasn't abstract to him. It was flesh and blood, laughter and loss, a future stolen before it could bloom. When Reyes flippantly offered to give him children, as if they were tokens of victory, she unknowingly held up a mirror to his deepest sorrow. It wasn't anger he felt, it was devastation. Because in her words, he heard the casual dismissal of everything his son had died protecting: dignity, humanity, the sacredness of life itself. And children wasn't just a flippant promise, it was a wound reopened, a sacred word twisted into mockery. In military culture, lineage is often spoken of in metaphors: sons and daughters of the service, passing the torch, raising the next generation of warriors. But for Thorn, it was literal. He'd raised a son to believe in service above self, and that son had given everything. To hear that profound sacrifice reduced to a bargaining chip in a power play felt like sacrilege. Worse, it revealed how disconnected the new generation had become from the human cost behind the ranks and ribbons. Thorn had spent years trying to bridge that gap, hosting family days, writing personal letters to Gold Star parents, insisting that casualty reports include not just names and ranks, but stories. He believed that if you forgot the person behind the uniform, you lost the soul of the mission. And now, in this sterile war room, that soul had been trivialized. Yet even in his pain, Thorn refused to retaliate. Why? Because he recognized the source of Reyes's outburst, not malice, but exhaustion. The same exhaustion he'd seen in his son's eyes before his final deployment, the look of someone giving everything to a cause that rarely gives back. He knew that when people lash out with words that wound, they are often screaming for someone to see their own pain. And so, instead of condemning her, he chose to understand her. That choice would change both their lives. In the days that followed, the military buzzed with rumors. Some called Reyes reckless. Others called her brave. But no one asked why she broke. Whispers spread through corridors and cafeterias. Did you hear what she said to Thorn? She's finished. Career suicide. Good. Someone needed to call him out. Opinions split along generational and gender lines. Senior officers shook their heads, muttering about lack of discipline. Younger troops, especially women and minorities, quietly celebrated her defiance, seeing in her a reflection of their own silent frustrations. Yet amid the speculation, no one considered the emotional toll of constant invisibility, the way being perpetually the exception grinds down even the strongest spirit. Reyes herself retreated into silence. She avoided the mess hall, skipped briefings unless required, and spent nights reviewing old mission logs, as if searching for proof that she'd ever truly mattered. She expected a reprimand, a transfer, maybe even a discharge. What she didn't expect was silence from Thorne. No disciplinary action. No public statement. Just nothing. And that silence was more unnerving than any punishment. It forced her to sit with her own words, to replay them in her mind until their hollowness echoed louder than their sting. She began to wonder, had she mistaken strength for cruelty? Had she become the very thing she swore to dismantle? The rumors swirled, but the truth remained buried, until Thorne made a decision that would shift everything. Thorne, however, requested a private meeting. Not to reprimand, but to listen. He sent a handwritten note, no email, no official memo, delivered by a junior aide at 0600 hours. It read simply, "My office. 1800. Coffee's on me." Empty. No rank, no formality. Just 2 initials and an invitation. Reyes almost didn't go. Pride warred with dread. But something in the simplicity of the note, the humanity of it, pulled her in. That evening, she stood outside his office door, heart pounding as if she were about to step into a combat zone. When she entered, she found not the imposing general of the war room, but a man in a worn sweater, sleeves rolled up, brewing coffee in a chipped pot that looked decades old. The walls were still lined with letters, but now she noticed the small details. A child's drawing taped beside a commendation, a faded photo of a young man in fatigues smiling beside a dog, a shelf of well-thumbed philosophy books. Thorne gestured to a chair. "Sit, Captain. Not as your CO. Just as someone who's been where you are." And then, instead of lecturing, he began to speak, not about doctrine or discipline, but about loss, legacy, and the loneliness of leadership. He told her about Daniel. About the nights he still woke up reaching for a phone to call him. About how he'd once been just as angry, just as convinced the system was rigged. "I thought respect had to be taken," he said, stirring his coffee slowly. "Turns out, it has to be built, together." Over black coffee in his modest office, he shared stories of his son, of grief that never fades, and of the burden of command that isolates even the strongest. He spoke of how Daniel had written him letters from the field, not about tactics, but about the children they treated, the families they protected, the hope they tried to leave behind. He believed the mission wasn't just to win wars, Thorne said, voice thick, but to make sure fewer had to be fought. He admitted that after Daniel's death, he'd nearly resigned, convinced he'd failed as both a father and a leader. It was only through mentoring young officers, seeing Daniel's spirit live on in their courage, that he found a reason to stay. "You remind me of him," he told Reyes, meeting her eyes without flinching. "Not in your words today, but in your fire. Don't let bitterness turn that fire into ash." Reyes sat in stunned silence, her carefully constructed walls crumbling with every sentence. She had come expecting judgment. Instead, she received grace. And in that grace, she saw the truth. Thorne wasn't the enemy of her ambition. He was its guardian. He hadn't blocked her path. He'd been clearing it, quietly, patiently, even when she couldn't see it. For the first time, she understood that real leadership isn't about dominating the room. It's about making space in it for others to rise. And in that quiet office, over bitter coffee and shared sorrow, a new kind of chain of command was forged, not of rank, but of mutual respect, hard-won and deeply human. Reyes sat in silence, her bravado crumbling like dry earth under rain. For the first time, she saw not a general, but a father. The uniform, the stars, the title, none of it mattered in that dimly lit office where grief and grace intertwined. Her hands, usually steady enough to disarm a live explosive, trembled around the warm ceramic mug. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, to justify, but no words came. What could she possibly say that wouldn't sound hollow after what she'd uttered in the war room? Instead, she let the silence do the work. And in that quiet, something profound shifted within her. The anger that had fueled her for years, the righteous fury at being sidelined, underestimated, and spoken over, began to dissolve, not into submission, but into sorrow. Sorrow for the pain she'd caused. Sorrow for the years she'd spent viewing leadership as a zero-sum game. Sorrow for assuming that every man in a high rank was part of the problem, when some, like Thorne, had been quietly fighting the same battles from the inside. She looked at the photo on his desk again, a young man with Thorne's eyes and a softer smile, standing beside a military medic tent, arms slung around a Syrian boy no older than 10. That was the legacy Thorne carried, Not conquest, not control, but compassion in uniform. And in that moment, Reyes understood the true cost of her words. She hadn't just insulted a superior officer. She'd mocked a father's deepest wound. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and tears, hot, unbidden, and utterly humiliating, slipped down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, not as weakness, but as surrender, to truth, to humility, to the terrifying vulnerability of being truly seen. "I didn't mean it," she whispered, tears finally falling. "I was angry, at everything but you." Her voice cracked, barely audible over the soft hum of the building's ventilation system. It wasn't an excuse, it was an admission. An acknowledgement that her outburst had been a misfire, aimed at the wrong target. She had been furious at a system that rewarded conformity over innovation, at promotion boards that valued pedigree over performance, at the unspoken rule that women had to be flawless while men were forgiven for being bold. She'd been angry at the sleepless nights spent proving her worth, only to have her ideas repackaged by someone with a deeper voice and a straighter path to the top. But none of that justified what she'd said. And Thorne, to his credit, didn't offer empty absolution. He didn't say, "It's okay." Because it wasn't. Instead, he nodded slowly, his eyes holding hers with a depth of understanding that felt almost sacred. "Anger is a compass, Captain," he said gently. "But if you let it steer the ship, you'll run aground." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, no longer the five-star general but a mentor speaking heart to heart. "You've got fire in you, that's clear. But fire can warm a home or burn it down. The difference isn't the flame. It's who holds the match." His words didn't scold, they invited. They didn't shame, they challenged. And in that challenge, Reyes found not condemnation, but a path forward, a way to channel her passion without losing her humanity. Thorne, however, requested a private meeting. Not to reprimand, but to listen. That choice alone spoke volumes about the kind of leader he was. In an institution built on hierarchy and discipline, where insubordination is often met with swift consequences, Thorne chose empathy over enforcement. He understood that discipline without understanding breeds resentment, not respect. And he knew that Reyes wasn't a rogue element, she was a symptom of a deeper cultural fracture. By inviting her into his space, not his office as a command center, but as a sanctuary of shared humanity, he modeled the very leadership he hoped to cultivate. During their conversation, he didn't dominate the dialogue. He asked questions. What do you need to feel heard? Where do you see the gaps in our system? How can I support you without speaking over you? These weren't performative inquiries. They were genuine attempts to bridge the chasm between generations and genders. He listened, truly listened, as Reyes haltingly described the isolation of being the only woman in high-stakes planning sessions, the exhaustion of code switching to sound less emotional, the fear that one mistake would confirm every stereotype. And when she finished, Thorne didn't offer platitudes. He said, "Then we change it. Not tomorrow. Not with a memo. But together." That "we" was revolutionary. It wasn't, "I'll fix it for you." It was, "We'll fix it with each other." In that single word, he restored her agency, and her dignity. In the days that followed, the quiet revolution began. Thorne didn't issue a grand directive or call a press conference. Instead, he started small. He restructured the next strategy session to include a rotating lead voice role, ensuring junior officers, especially women and minorities, had uninterrupted time to present their plans without interruption. He mandated that all promotion boards include at least one officer from an underrepresented group. He revived a dormant mentorship program and personally paired senior leaders with rising talent, emphasizing reverse mentorship, where young officers taught generals about cyber warfare, cultural intelligence, and inclusive leadership. Reyes, still reeling from their conversation, was asked to co-lead the initiative. At first, she hesitated. "After what I said, you trust me with this?" Thorne simply replied, "I trust you more now than before, because you've shown you can confront your own flaws. That's the mark of a true leader." Slowly, the culture began to shift. Officers started speaking up in meetings without fear of being labeled difficult. Ideas were evaluated on merit, not the rank of the person who proposed them. And respect, real, earned, mutual respect, started to replace the brittle performance of obedience. The change wasn't overnight, and it wasn't perfect. But it was real. And it started with two people choosing understanding over ego. Months later, during a joint operation in the Pacific, Reyes led a flawless extraction under fire, earning a Silver Star and Thorne's public commendation. The mission had been high risk, rescuing a downed reconnaissance team from a hostile island chain, with enemy patrols closing in and weather deteriorating by the hour. Reyes's plan, once dismissed as overly aggressive, was now the blueprint. She coordinated drone cover, naval support, and ground insertion with surgical precision, adapting in real time when communications failed and a team member was injured. She made split-second decisions that saved lives, all while maintaining composure that inspired her unit. When the last soldier was aboard the extraction chopper, she radioed command with calm clarity, all personnel accounted for. Mission complete. Back at headquarters, the debrief was unlike any before. Thorne didn't just praise her tactics, he highlighted her leadership. Captain Reyes didn't just execute a plan, he told the assembled officers. She created trust in chaos. That's not aggression. That's excellence. And when the Silver Star was pinned to her chest during the ceremony, it wasn't just a medal, it was vindication. Not just for her, but for every officer who'd been told their passion was a liability. The moment was broadcast across military channels, not as propaganda, but as proof that the culture was changing. And at the center of it stood two figures once divided by words, but now united by purpose. At the ceremony, he placed the medal on her chest and said, "You've already given me something far greater than children. You've given this service your integrity." The words echoed through the hushed auditorium, silencing even the rustle of uniforms. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't part of the official commendation. It was raw, personal, and devastatingly tender, a quiet reclamation of the phrase that had once torn them apart. In that single sentence, Thorne transformed insult into honor, pain into purpose. He didn't just forgive her, he elevated her. And in doing so, he reminded everyone present that the military's greatest asset wasn't its firepower or its technology, but the moral courage of those who wore the uniform. Reyes stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on his, tears glistening but unshed. She didn't bow her head in shame, she held it high in quiet dignity. Because this moment wasn't about redemption alone, it was about restoration. Not just of her reputation, but of the covenant between leaders and those they lead. The audience, generals, sergeants, cadets, and families, felt the weight of it. A young female lieutenant in the third row clutched her notebook tighter, whispering to her friend, "That could be us." An aging colonel wiped his eyes, remembering his own missteps and the mentors who'd given him second chances. In that room, the rigid lines of rank blurred into something more human, a community bound not by hierarchy, but by shared values and hard-won trust. Thorne's words became more than a compliment, they became a creed. And from that day forward, integrity over inheritance was quietly adopted as an unofficial motto among the new generation of officers. The moment went viral, not for drama, but for dignity. A junior public affairs officer, moved by the authenticity of the exchange, discreetly recorded the ceremony, with permission, and shared a 45-second clip internally. Within hours, it spread across secure military networks, then to veteran forums, and eventually to mainstream news outlets. But unlike most viral military moments, helicopter stunts, heroic rescues, or political controversies, this one resonated because it was quiet. There were no explosions, no flags waving dramatically in the wind. Just two people, standing in uniform, healing a rift with honesty. Headlines read, "When a general chooses grace over rank," and "The medal that mended a military moment." Social media flooded with testimonials, female veterans sharing their own stories of being told they were too emotional to lead, retired sergeants praising Thorne for modeling true leadership, parents writing that they'd show the clip to their daughters as proof that honor still matters. Even critics of the military's slow progress on inclusion admitted this was a turning point. The clip wasn't weaponized, it was worshipped. Not as propaganda, but as proof that institutions can evolve when individuals choose empathy over ego. And in an era of polarization and performativity, this unscripted moment of humility became a beacon. It reminded millions that strength isn't loud, it's steady. That leadership isn't about never falling, it's about helping others rise after you've both stumbled. Today, Captain Reyes trains the next generation of officers, teaching them that true power lies not in belittling others, but in lifting them. Promoted to major within the year, She now leads the Leadership and Ethics Division at Fort Leavenworth, a role she never imagined she'd hold. Her curriculum is unconventional. Alongside tactics and strategy, she teaches emotional intelligence, active listening, and the history of exclusion within the armed forces, not to shame, but to illuminate. She shares her own story, the outburst, the shame, the coffee with Thorn, not as a cautionary tale, but as a case study in transformation. Mistakes don't define you, she tells her students. What you do after them does. Her classes are oversubscribed. Cadets line up early, not just for her reputation, but for her authenticity. She doesn't pretend to have all the answers. Instead, she creates space for hard questions. How do you lead when you're the only woman in the room? How do you challenge authority without burning bridges? How do you stay passionate without becoming bitter? And when a young officer snaps under pressure or lashes out in frustration, Reyes doesn't punish, they talk. Over coffee. Just like Thorn did for her. She's become known not just for her brilliance, but for her grace under fire, especially the internal kind. And in every lesson, she echoes Thorn's wisdom. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's who you lift up along the way. And General Thorn? He still keeps a photo on his desk, not of battles won, but of a young woman who reminded him that leadership begins with listening. Though he officially retired 6 months after the Pacific operation, his influence only grew. He declined lucrative defense contractor offers, and instead became a senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense on inclusion and mentorship. But his proudest role remains unofficial, elder statesman of the quiet revolution he helped ignite. His office at the Pentagon, now modestly repurposed as a reflection space for officers in crisis, still bears the same chipped coffee pot, the same letters from Gold Star families, and now, a new addition, a framed still from the Silver Star ceremony, showing Reyes standing tall as he pins the medal. Visitors often ask why he keeps it. He simply smiles and says, because she taught me that even the strongest institutions need to be reminded of their humanity. He corresponds regularly with Reyes, exchanging notes on policy, pedagogy, and the occasional personal struggle. Their bond isn't father-daughter, mentor-protege, or even friend-friend. It's something rarer. Two warriors who faced each other in the arena of ego and chose, instead, to build a bridge. And that bridge now carries hundreds of officers across the chasms of bias, burnout, and blind tradition. Thorn may have shaped modern defense doctrine, but his final, most enduring legacy is this, proving that the highest form of command is compassion. If this story moved you, if you believe in honor over ego, and courage over cruelty, subscribe. Because the world needs more stories where strength is measured not by rank, but by heart. In an age where leadership is often reduced to tweets, sound bites, and power grabs, we must remember that real change begins in quiet rooms, over bitter coffee, between two people willing to see each other fully. This isn't just a military story, it's a human one. It's about redemption, mentorship, and the radical act of choosing understanding when anger is easier. By subscribing, you join a community that refuses to accept cynicism as the default. You support storytelling that uplifts, challenges, and heals. You say yes to a world where leaders don't demand loyalty, they earn it through integrity. So hit that button. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, a young leader, a weary veteran, a student dreaming of service. Let's keep this conversation alive. Because the next Captain Reyes is out there right now, wondering if her voice matters. And the next General Thorn is waiting, not to silence her, but to listen. Subscribe. Stay inspired. And never forget, the most powerful weapon isn't on your belt, it's in your character.